Now, let's bring in the White House Chief of Staff, Mr. McDonough. Welcome back to Fox News Sunday.
Thanks so much, Chris.
The White House has made it clear that it flatly opposes paying ransom for any hostages. But now ISIS is making a new demand, offering a swap of the Japanese hostage for a terrorist being held in Jordan. Is that something to be considered?
You know, our policies on this are pretty well set, Chris. We don't get into negotiations with terrorists. We don't pay ransom because that cash then fuels further kidnappings, which just continues to exacerbate the problem. So we're not going to do that.
And a prisoner swap?
We're not going to do that.
And you would advise the Japanese not to do that?
Well, I'm not going to get in a conversation with the Japanese on your show, but I'm not here to talk about that today, and I don't anticipate.
But I take you view it as another form of ransom.
Well, that's the way we've treated this.
Okay. This week, House Speaker Boehner invited and Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu accepted an invitation to come to Congress in March to talk about Iran. All of this doing it without any consultation of the White House. A senior U.S. official is quoted in a major Israeli newspaper as saying this about Netanyahu: he spat in our face publicly, and that's no way to behave. Netanyahu ought to remember that President Obama has a year and a half left to his presidency and that there will be a price. What's the price?
Look, I don't know who made that quote. That's not my position. That's not the president's position. And our view is that, as a traditional matter, we have avoided getting in the middle of our friends, even our closest friends, like Great Britain or Israel, getting in the middle of their campaigns. Given the proximity of this visit to that election in Israel, we just think it doesn't make any sense for us to have a meeting. So that's how we're going to treat it. But also, let's take a step back and talk a little bit about the strength of this bilateral relationship and its breadth, from our shared values to intelligence to military.
I understand that.
And that's exactly how we're going to treat this.
But are you angry, honestly? Is the President, is the White House, are you angry with Speaker Boehner for doing this on his own and for Netanyahu accepting it on his own without any consultation with the White House?
Look, I don't spend a lot of time on my emotions or getting angry or otherwise. I spend a lot of time dealing with the situations that we're presented with. And here's the way the President has always seen the U.S.-Israel relationship: as above partisan politics, something that is fundamentally in our interests. And so that's how we'll continue to treat this, irrespective of how this thing goes back and forth.
But the fact is that the Secretary of State, John Kerry, met with the Israeli ambassador to the U.S., Mr. Dermer, for 2 hours on Tuesday. Dermer never mentioned that to him. Doesn't that raise issues about the strength of the relationship?
The strength of this relationship is based on our shared values, the shared threats we confront, and the shared opportunities we create. We'll continue to do that. We'll continue to support our ally. You know, I'll let Secretary Kerry or maybe even Ambassador Dermer explain why that occurred the way it did. The President's view is this relationship is in the national interest. It should be treated as nonpartisan. That's the way it's always been treated, and that's exactly how we'll do it.
Just 4 months ago, the President was bragging about his policy in Yemen. Take a look.
This strategy of taking out terrorists who threaten us while supporting partners on the front lines is one that we have successfully pursued in Yemen and Somalia for years.
But now Yemen's government has collapsed. There are reports that the U.S. has had to suspend some of our counterterrorism efforts against al-Qaeda in Yemen, AQAP. How much is the chaos in Yemen going to hurt our effort to fight perhaps the greatest terror threat we face?
Going back to 2007, Chris, the President has been very clear that his administration will be about taking the fight to al-Qaeda and its affiliates where they are, based on our terms, and ensuring that we do not face the kind of threat that we faced in 2001. That's exactly what we're doing. What the President said just there on the TV is that he just said that what we're doing in Yemen is not occupying Yemen with a large ground force. What we're doing is training Yemenis to take the fight to AQAP, making sure that we have the wherewithal, intelligence and wherewithal to take out threats when they are presented to us, when they threaten our people and our interests. That, by the way, Chris, is exactly what we've done in Yemen, and we will continue to do that.
But to repeat my question, the fact is that the intelligence agencies that you have dealt with in going after AQAP, the defense agencies you've dealt with, they are no longer under any control. It's in chaos. Isn't that going to hurt our effort against al-Qaeda in Yemen?
This is what we know about al-Qaeda, be it in Syria, be it in Iraq, be it in Afghanistan, Pakistan, or on the Arabian Peninsula. They're going to go into the dark corners where it's difficult for us to get to them. That means that we're always going to be dealing with difficult political situations. We're going to have to be dealing with partners who are less than perfect. That's why we're going to work with them, train them, because this is as much their fight as it is our fight. And when we need to, Chris, we'll take action to protect ourselves. You've seen this president do that time and again, and we'll do it when we need to.
Let's turn to domestic issues. Does President Obama realize that he lost the midterm election?
What the president realizes, and he laid this out in the speech last night, is that over the course of now decades, middle-class families in this country have faced unrelenting pressure as costs go up while wages stagnate. What the president laid out in the speech on Tuesday night is a plan to say, hey, let's put the middle class first in this country for once. Let's close some loopholes, invest in them, things like child care, job training, community college, and make sure that they can get the kind of opportunities that we all had when we were growing up in middle-class families.
Forgive me,
Chris.
during the campaign, the president said that his agenda was, the midterms were in effect going to be a referendum on his agenda. Take a look.
Now, I'm not on the ballot this fall, but make no mistake, these policies are on the ballot. Every single one of them.
And yet, despite the fact that Republicans gained 9 seats and took control of the Senate, gained 13 seats in the House, the president didn't acknowledge the fact that Republicans won the midterms and didn't basically scale back any of his agenda to reach out to Republicans.
Here's what we've done since the midterms. We've normalized relations with Cuba, a policy that for 50 years had been failing. We've made great strides on carbon
Dennis,
pollution.
Respectfully, you're not answering my question.
We laid out a plan for the middle class on Tuesday night. In the meantime, the Republicans have debated a single infrastructure project for 3 weeks. They've debated among themselves over how to address women's health issues. And for just going back to the first set of issues, as I look at it, I don't see a pathway to getting the DHS appropriations bill, which funds things like counterterrorism, our aviation security. I don't see a path to how they get that done. I hope they'll lay that out for us this week. We're ready to work with them on all these things, Chris.
You say you're ready to work with them.
But we need to make sure that we got to get things like the DHS appropriations bill done.
The president famously said in 2009 to Eric Cantor, elections have consequences. I won. Well, guess what? In November, the Republicans won. What are the consequences? Doesn't the president need to scale back his agenda to find areas of agreement with the Republicans who won the midterm?
The president's laid out a lot of places in the speech as well where we can work with Republicans. Precision medicine, you saw that in the newspaper today. Things like trade, things like infrastructure, things like research and development, which have traditionally been nonpartisan issues. We're ready to work on those. But the other thing, here's where the president is not going to trim back his agenda, Chris. He is not going to say that we should trim back our agenda working for middle-class families in this country. He's not. That it's decades now that wages have stagnated for hardworking middle-class families. He is saying enough is enough. We're out of the crisis of the last several years. Unemployment's down under 5.6%. More oil produced in this country than at any time in the last several decades.
No thanks to the Obama administration.
Well, you know, sometimes
it's all happening on.
Sometimes you guys, sometimes Chris, you're inclined to tell us that we're responsible for things that are happening that are bad, but we're not responsible for anything that's good.
No, it didn't happen on federal land. It happened on private land and state land, and in fact, the administration was opposed to a lot of the fracking. One last question, if I may,
because more clean energy than ever in this country.
Again, no thanks to the administration.
More oil and gas produced in this country than ever before.
Again, no thanks to the administration.
We're producing more than we import for the first time in 2 decades. That means lower energy prices. That means more jobs. And it's time for us to focus on the middle class.
Okay.
The president will not trim his sails on that, Chris. He will not.
All right. One last question, sir. The president wants to pay for free community college, for increased child care, tax credits, by raising taxes on the wealthy, $210 billion over 10 years. And his argument is the same as it's been since he came into office. Take a look.
And we're helping to ensure that all Americans are contributing their fair share.
To pay our fair share, folks making $1 million or more, so that we can help folks who are struggling to get by.
Everyone pays their fair share. Everyone does their part. Everyone does their fair share. Everyone plays by the same set of rules.
But during the Obama years, the top capital gains rate has jumped from 15% to 23.8%, and he'd now like to raise it to 28%. And the top income tax rate has gone from 35% to 39.6%. Question: what is a top earner's fair share of taxes?
You know, it's interesting you point out the capital gains rate that the president wants to make sure that Congress gets agreement to do. That brings it back to where it was under President Reagan. Somebody who I think you and many of us in this town believe was a record tax cutter.
The tax rate was when President Reagan came into office was 70%.
Which was, he was a record tax cutter. So we're going back to a capital gains rate, 28%, that President Reagan had and laid out. Now, let's also ask ourselves a question about this, Chris, which is to say, what the president is laying out is trying to close a trust fund loophole, which is to say, if you have a trust fund, when you pass, it ought to just be treated like any other asset that you have.
It isn't. Wait. It's not a trust fund. It isn't. That's a nice talking point. I'm sure it's been focus group. It isn't what it is. It is what somebody has saved their whole lives. They've invested in something. Now it's a question is whether or not you pay at the basis at which they bought it, or the value of it now. It's not a trust fund, sir.
Well, look.
But let me just ask you, what is it, if I may?
Let's agree to disagree on this.
What is a fair share of taxes for a top earner? Is it 30%? Is it 40%? And is there some point, this is the real question, is there some point at which raising taxes on people hurts the economy?
Two things. What the president is talking about is taking capital gains back to the rate at which President Reagan taxed capital gains, point one. Point two, since the president has taken office, we've gone from 10% unemployment to 5.6% unemployment. The deficit has been cut by 2/3.
If labor force participation was what it was back in 2009, it'd be 9% unemployment.
We've seen that deficits cut by 2/3. We see 10 million people with access to health care now. Health care costs growing at a slower rate than any time in 50 years. And we're creating more jobs through oil and gas and clean energy than ever before. So ask yourself that, Chris. What are the data telling us about what's happening in the economy? The economy is coming back. It's growing. But we are focused on a simple fact. For too many decades, with stagnant wages, the middle class has not gotten its fair shot. We're going to make sure that it does. We'll keep pushing this. This we will not trim our sails on.
Mr. McDonough, thank you. Thanks for coming in today. Always good to talk with you, sir.
Great to see you, Chris. Thanks a lot.
I always enjoy it.
So do I.
Good.